Everyone thought he had the perfect life, but inside he was dying. Dr. Michael Chen stood at the Family Feud podium, his hands perfectly steady despite the storm raging inside his mind. At 25, he was everything his immigrant parents had dreamed of when they came to America. Harvard Medical School graduate, chief resident at Johns Hopkins, the golden child who had made every sacrifice worth it. But beneath his perfectly pressed suit and confident smile, Michael was drowning. And in the next few minutes, Steve Harvey would witness the catastrophic collapse of a man who had spent his entire life being perfect for everyone except himself. It was a bright Tuesday morning at the Family Feud studios in Los Angeles. The Chen family had flown in from Baltimore, their excitement palpable as they entered the iconic studio. There was Dr. Robert Chen, 62, a retired professor who had immigrated from Taiwan 40 years ago with nothing but determination and dreams for his children. His wife, Dr. Susan Chen, 59, a research scientist who had worked double shifts to put her children through the best schools money could buy. Their daughter, Lisa, 28, a successful lawyer who had followed her parents' blueprint for success to the letter. And Michael, the crown jewel of the family's American dream, the proof that everything they had sacrificed had been worth it. The studio buzzed with its familiar energy. Golden lights bathed everything in television warmth. The iconic Family Feud logo sparkled behind Steve Harvey's podium like a beacon of family celebration. 300 audience members filled the bleachers, their excitement creating an electric atmosphere. This was supposed to be the Chen family's victory lap, their moment to showcase the success story of the American dream. Steve Harvey commanded the stage in his perfectly tailored burgundy suit, his smile infectious, his energy boundless. During the family introductions, he had been immediately impressed by the Chen family's achievement. Dr. Michael Chen, Steve had announced with admiration, chief resident at Johns Hopkins at 25 years old. "That's incredible, young man." Michael had smiled the same perfect smile he'd been practicing since childhood. "Thank you, Steve. Just trying to help people." But Steve, with his decades of reading people, had noticed something in Michael's eyes, a darkness that didn't match his perfect answers, a fatigue that went deeper than medical residency exhaustion. The game began with its usual fanfare. The Chen family faced off against the Rodriguez family from Phoenix, and the competitive energy was intense but respectful. Robert's academic background made him perfect for intellectual questions. Susan's scientific training helped her with logical reasoning. Lisa's legal mind cut through complex scenarios with ease, but it was Michael who dominated the early rounds. His answers were precise, thoughtful, delivered with the kind of confidence that came from never being allowed to fail. The first 3 rounds went smoothly. The Chen family built a commanding lead, their teamwork reflecting decades of shared high expectations and mutual pressure to succeed. Steve worked the crowd, made his jokes, and celebrated this family that seemed to embody everything America promised to those willing to work hard enough. But during the 4th round, everything began to unravel. Steve walked to center stage with his usual enthusiasm, completely unaware he was about to trigger the breakdown of a man who had been holding himself together through pure willpower for months. "All right, Chen family, we surveyed 100 people. Top 5 answers on the board." He paused, his smile bright and encouraging. "Name something that people say leads to success." It should have been an easy question for this high-achieving family. Hard work, education, determination, the kind of values they had built their entire lives around. Robert stepped up to the podium first, his confidence clear. Success was his area of expertise. "Education," he said with the authority of someone who had dedicated his life to learning. "Good answer." Survey said education was number 2 on the board. The family celebrated appropriately, but Michael noticed how his father looked at him after answering, as if reminding him of the investment that had been made in his success. "Susan," Steve called out. "Your turn, Dr. Chen." Susan approached the podium with the precision of a scientist approaching an experiment. "Hard work," she said firmly, glancing at her son with pride. "Hard work," survey said. Number one answer. The board lit up, and the family celebrated, but Michael felt each cheer like a weight added to his shoulders. "Lisa," Steve announced. "You're up, counselor." Lisa stepped to the podium with her lawyer's confidence, but she too glanced at Michael as she prepared to answer. "Dedication," she said, her voice carrying the expectation that her brother exemplified this virtue. "Dedication. Good answer," survey says. Number 3 on the board. Another celebration, another expectation, another reminder of what Michael was supposed to represent. "Michael," Steve called out with enthusiasm. "Dr. Chen, your family's got this locked up. Name something that people say leads to success." Michael approached the podium, and for the first time since the game began, his perfect composure showed a crack. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the buzzer. The studio lights suddenly felt too bright. The audience noise became overwhelming. The weight of 25 years of being the perfect son, perfect student, perfect doctor crashed down on him all at once. "Success?" he repeated, his voice strangely hollow. The seconds ticked by. His family watched expectantly. The Rodriguez family waited politely. 300 audience members held their breath. And then Dr. Michael Chen, chief resident at Johns Hopkins, Harvard Medical School graduate, the golden child of the American dream, broke completely. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice so quiet the microphones barely picked it up. Steve's smile faded. The studio energy shifted from excitement to concern. "I'm sorry?" Steve said gently, stepping closer to Michael. "I don't know what leads to success," Michael said louder now, his voice beginning to crack. "Because I've done everything right and I want to die." The admission hit the studio like a physical blow. Several audience members gasped audibly. The Rodriguez family looked on with growing alarm and sympathy. Michael's perfect facade crumbled completely. "Everyone thinks I'm successful," he continued, tears beginning to stream down his face. "But I haven't slept more than 2 hours a night in 6 months. I have panic attacks in hospital supply closets. I prescription shop for anxiety medication because I can't admit I need help." His family stared at him in shock. This wasn't the Michael they knew. This wasn't the success story they had crafted. "I became a doctor because it was what you wanted," Michael said, looking directly at his parents. "I went to Harvard because it looked good on your Christmas cards. I work 18-hour days because I'm terrified of disappointing anyone." Steve Harvey had never heard anything quite like this. This wasn't just a family moment. This was a mental health crisis happening live on television. "Michael," Steve said, his voice stripped of all performance, "when was the last time you felt happy?" Michael stared at Steve for a long moment, searching his memory. "I can't remember," he whispered. "Maybe when I was 8, before I understood that love was conditional on achievement." The studio fell completely silent. This was no longer a game show. This was an intervention. "Michael," Steve said, setting down his cards and walking directly to the young man. "Look at me, son." Michael raised his eyes to meet Steve's, and the older man saw something that broke his heart. He saw a brilliant, accomplished young man who had never been allowed to fail, never been permitted to be human, never been loved for who he was, rather than what he achieved. "When did you start having thoughts about hurting yourself?" Steve asked, his voice gentle but direct. 6 months ago, Michael admitted. "When I realized I was going to be chief resident and all I felt was dread. I saved 3 lives that day." and all I could think about was ending my own. Behind the scenes, producers were frantically calling for medical personnel. This had moved far beyond entertainment into genuine crisis intervention. But Steve Harvey, father and mentor, wasn't thinking about television ratings. He was thinking about saving a life. "Michael," Steve said, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are not your achievements. You are not your parents' dreams. You are not your medical degree, or your perfect grades, or your spotless record." Michael was sobbing now, 25 years of suppressed humanity pouring out. "You are a human being who deserves to be loved for who you are, not what you accomplish. And the fact that you're standing here admitting you need help, that takes more courage than any medical procedure you've ever performed." Steve turned to address Robert and Susan directly. "Dr. and Dr. Chen, I need you to hear what your son just told us. He's been thinking about suicide. Your successful, perfect son has been planning to end his life because the pressure to be perfect has become unbearable." Robert's face crumpled. Susan brought her hands to her mouth in horror. "We didn't know," Susan whispered. "We thought we were motivating him. We thought we were helping him succeed." "You were loving him the only way you knew how," Steve said, not harshly but firmly. "But love that only comes with conditions isn't love. It's a transaction, and your son has been paying a price he can't afford." Steve removed his suit jacket and placed it around Michael's shoulders. "This jacket has been with me through every success and failure I've had," Steve said. "But today it's going to remember something more important than any achievement. It's going to remember the day a young man chose life over perfection." The hug that followed encompassed the entire Chen family, but this time it was different. It wasn't about celebrating success. It was about choosing love over achievement, humanity over perfection. Steve addressed the camera directly. "If there's anyone watching this who feels like Michael does, I need you to hear this. You are more than your achievements. You are worthy of love even when you fail. And if you're having thoughts about hurting yourself, please, please reach out for help." But Steve wasn't finished. He pulled out his personal business card and pressed it into Michael's hands. "This has my private number," he said. "Not for the show, for you. Because what you did today, choosing to be honest instead of perfect, that's the bravest thing I've seen in 30 years of television." The episode that aired became the most important Family Feud episode in the show's history, not because of entertainment value, but because it saved lives. Within hours of airing, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline reported a 300% increase in calls. Medical schools across the country began implementing mandatory mental health programs. The response was overwhelming but also heartbreaking. Thousands of letters poured in from high-achieving young people who recognized themselves in Michael's story. Dr. Jennifer Park, a surgical resident in Chicago, wrote, "I watched Michael break down and realized I was headed for the same cliff. Thank you for showing me it's okay to not be okay." David Kim, a pre-med student at Yale, wrote, "I've been planning my suicide for months. Michael's courage gave me the courage to get help instead." The impact on the medical community was profound. The episode sparked conversations about the mental health crisis among medical professionals, the toxic culture of perfectionism in medicine, and the need for systemic change. 3 months after the episode aired, Michael made the hardest decision of his life. He took a leave of absence from his residency and entered intensive therapy and treatment for anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. His parents, devastated by their role in his crisis, entered family therapy to learn how to love their son unconditionally. Lisa, seeing her brother's courage, finally admitted she too had been struggling with anxiety and perfectionism. The family began healing together. 6 months later, Michael returned to medicine, but on his own terms. He specialized in emergency medicine, drawn to the raw humanity of the work rather than the prestige of specialized surgery. He also became an advocate for mental health in medicine, speaking at medical schools about the dangers of perfectionism and the importance of seeking help. The jacket that Steve gave Michael hangs in his apartment today, a reminder that strength isn't about being perfect, it's about being honest. Steve Harvey learned something that day that changed how he thought about success and achievement. He learned that the most successful people are often the most fragile, and that asking "How are you doing?" is more important than asking "What have you accomplished?" And Michael Chen learned that his parents' love didn't have to be earned through achievements. It was there all along, buried under expectations but never absent. He learned that being human isn't a failure, it's the point. He learned that the golden child doesn't have to be made of gold to be valuable. Sometimes the most precious thing about a person is their willingness to admit they're breaking. Most importantly, he learned that choosing life over perfection isn't giving up on success. It's redefining what success really means. Because that's what courage looks like when it's honest rather than polished. That's what strength sounds like when it asks for help instead of pretending to have all the answers. And that's what happens when a golden child discovers that being human is more valuable than being perfect. The truth Michael discovered that day wasn't that he was failing, it was that he was finally succeeding at being himself. But the healing didn't happen overnight. The weeks following the episode were some of the most difficult of Michael's life. The medical community's response was mixed. Some colleagues reached out with support and shared their own struggles. Others whispered about his weakness and questioned whether someone with mental health issues should be practicing medicine. Dr. James Morrison, the chief of surgery at Johns Hopkins, called Michael into his office 3 days after the episode aired. "Son," he said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional concern, "we need to discuss your future here." Michael sat across from the man whose approval he had desperately sought for 2 years, feeling strangely calm for the first time in months. "I know what you're going to say," Michael replied. "That doctors need to be strong, that patients need to trust us, that mental illness is incompatible with medical practice." Dr. Morrison studied Michael's face, surprised by the young man's directness. "Actually," Morrison said slowly, "I was going to thank you." Michael's eyes widened in surprise. "My daughter is a second-year medical student at Stanford," Morrison continued. "She called me crying after watching your episode. She's been having panic attacks for months, convinced she wasn't smart enough, wasn't strong enough to be a doctor." Morrison paused, his professional composure wavering slightly. "She was planning to drop out rather than admit she was struggling. Your courage gave her the courage to get help. You may have saved her career, possibly her life." The conversation that followed changed both men's perspectives on what it meant to be a healer. "Michael," Morrison said, "we've created a culture in medicine where being human is seen as weakness. But patients don't need perfect doctors, they need caring ones. And you can't truly care for others if you don't know how to care for yourself." 2 weeks later, Johns Hopkins announced a new mental health initiative for medical residents, with Michael as its first spokesperson. The response from medical students across the country was overwhelming. Michael received hundreds of emails from future doctors who had been suffering in silence, believing that admitting struggle meant admitting inadequacy. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation, a psychiatry resident at UCLA, wrote, "I've been working in mental health while hiding my own depression for 3 years. Your honesty gave me permission to be honest with myself and my patients." Mark Rodriguez, a third-year medical student at Harvard, wrote, "I was planning to end my life after failing my surgery rotation. Your episode showed me that failure isn't the end of everything, I retook the rotation and passed. More importantly, I learned that my worth isn't determined by my grades. But perhaps the most powerful response came from an unexpected source, Michael's own patients. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, an 82-year-old woman Michael had treated in the emergency department, sought him out after learning about his story. "Doctor," she said, taking his hands in her weathered ones. "I've been treated by a lot of doctors in my 82 years. The best ones weren't the ones who never made mistakes. They were the ones who understood what it meant to hurt." She squeezed his hands gently. "What you did on that television show wasn't weakness, it was wisdom, and it made you a better doctor, not a worse one." 6 months after the episode aired, Michael received an invitation that would change his perspective even further. The American Medical Association asked him to deliver the keynote address at their annual conference on physician wellness. Standing before 2,000 of the country's top medical professionals, Michael shared something that would become one of the most quoted speeches in medical education. "We take an oath to first do no harm," he began, "but we've created a system that does tremendous harm to those who practice within it." His voice carried across the auditorium with a strength that came from authentic experience rather than academic theory. "We teach medical students to diagnose and treat depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation in their patients, but we create a culture where those same students can't seek help for their own mental health without fear of professional consequences." The audience, initially skeptical, grew increasingly attentive as Michael shared statistics they couldn't ignore. Medical students attempt suicide at twice the rate of the general population. Residents suffer from depression at rates higher than combat veterans. We're losing brilliant, compassionate healers, not to academic failure, but to a system that equates human struggle with professional inadequacy. By the end of his 20-minute speech, Michael had received the first standing ovation in the conference's history. But the real change came in the months that followed. Medical schools across the country began implementing mandatory mental health education, not just for treating patients, but for self-care. The Michael Chen Initiative became a national movement, advocating for systemic changes in medical education and training. 3 major medical schools revised their honor codes to explicitly state that seeking mental health treatment would not impact academic or professional standing. The National Board of Medical Examiners began including questions about physician wellness and mental health on licensing examinations. But the most personal impact came within Michael's own family. His parents, Robert and Susan, spent months in therapy learning to separate their love from their expectations. In a letter Michael would treasure forever, his father wrote, "Son, I came to America to give you opportunities I never had, but I realize now that in pushing you toward success, I almost pushed you away from life itself. I'm proud of your achievements, but I'm prouder of your courage to choose healing over hiding." His mother's transformation was equally profound. Susan began speaking at Asian American community centers about the pressure placed on children to fulfill their parents' dreams. "We thought love meant pushing them to excel," she would tell audiences. "We didn't realize we were pushing them toward a cliff." Lisa, Michael's sister, also found healing through her brother's courage. She left her high-pressure law firm to work for a nonprofit providing legal aid to low-income families. "Michael showed me that success without happiness isn't success at all," she explained to their parents when they expressed concern about her career change. The family that had once gathered to celebrate achievements began gathering simply to enjoy each other's company. 1 year after the Family Feud episode, Michael made another difficult but important decision. He left Johns Hopkins to work at a community hospital in Baltimore's underserved areas. His colleagues questioned the move. Community medicine paid less, offered fewer research opportunities, and carried less prestige than his previous position. But Michael had learned something more valuable than professional advancement. He had learned that healing others begins with healing yourself. Dr. Maria Santos, the chief of medicine at Michael's new hospital, noticed something different about him immediately. "I've worked with a lot of residents," she told him during his first week. "The brilliant ones often burn out because they're running from something, but you seem to be running towards something. What's the difference?" Michael smiled, thinking of the jacket Steve Harvey had given him, still hanging in his apartment as a reminder of the day his real life began. "I stopped trying to be perfect," he said simply, "and I started trying to be helpful." 2 years later, Michael was recognized not for his academic achievements, but for his innovation in treating the whole person, not just their medical condition. His emergency department became the first in the country to integrate mental health screening into routine care, acknowledging that psychological and physical health are inseparable. Patients began requesting Dr. Michael specifically, not because he never made mistakes, but because he understood what it meant to struggle and still choose hope. Steve Harvey stayed in touch with Michael, checking in regularly on the young man whose breakdown had become a breakthrough. In their last conversation, Steve asked Michael what he had learned from the experience. "I learned that golden children aren't made of gold," Michael replied. "They're made of the same stuff as everyone else. Fear, hope, love, pain. And that's not something to hide, that's something to honor." Steve smiled, remembering the broken young man who had stood at the Family Feud podium 2 years earlier. "And what would you tell that 25-year-old doctor who wanted to die rather than disappoint anyone?" Michael thought for a moment before answering. "I'd tell him that disappointing others is temporary, but disappointing yourself is forever. And that the only success that matters is the one that lets you sleep at night and look at yourself in the mirror without shame." Today, Michael Chen continues practicing emergency medicine in Baltimore. His office wall displays his medical degree from Harvard, but next to it hangs a handwritten note from a patient: "Thank you for seeing me as a person, not just a problem to solve." The note matters more to him than any academic honor ever could, because that's what healing looks like when it's honest rather than perfect. That's what success sounds like when it's measured in lives touched rather than achievements accumulated. And that's what happens when a golden child discovers that the most valuable thing about them isn't their perfection, but their humanity. The truth Michael learned that day continues to transform lives, one honest conversation at a time. Because sometimes the most important medicine isn't found in a prescription bottle. It's found in the courage to admit that even doctors need healing, even golden children can break, and even perfect people deserve love just for being human. And that love, unconditional and transformative, is the only success that really matters. Artifacts download all Silent Scream story. Document MD the Adopted Truth Story. Document MD the Invisible Caregiver. Fixed Document MD the Invisible Caregiver. Story Document MD the Last Goodbye Story. Document MD the Last Teacher Story. Document MD the Last Teacher Story. Document MD the Silent Teacher Story. Document MD the Silent Teacher Story. Document